And another maybe misconception that we have about Hoover is that he did not do enough to help prevent the economic downturn or do enough in terms of government programs or obviously you outline in your book that he created more federal jobs, and there are numerous things and actions he took, um, and in my mind this is one of those. I spoke recently to a writer on economics named Nicholas Wapshot, and he wrote a book called Keynes Hayek about 10 years ago. And this seems to me a very Keynesian versus Hayek kind of fight. But so with, for example, with Hayek, it would be, there should be no government action. But Nicholas Wapshot had a good line. He said, well, there are no, I feel like everyone is a Keynesian in the well, when push comes to shove, they're always going to be Keynesians, and that's indicative of George Bush in 2008, and I think with Hoover during the beginning of the Great Depression, because maybe he didn't want to take as much government action, he didn't believe in it, but he felt like he had to do something. So, do we completely misunderstand his role in trying to uh, do something during the Depression?
Yeah, it's an interesting situation. Hoover was as progressive as Republicans got in the 1920s, and when there was a depression, brief one in 1921, it was Hoover that convinced Warren Harding that the federal government actually had a role to play during a depression, and that it could introduce counter-cyclical policies and stimulate the economy when the economy was in a down cycle. So he was way ahead of his time on that, and it was controversial at the time. But Harding let Hoover push it through. Harding really admired Hoover. So that was probably the last time in American life where an administration had a choice to sit on the sidelines when the economy turned down and do nothing. And because after you've done it once, as Hoover did in 21, after you've said, well, we can introduce countercyclical policies, we have a responsibility to do everything in our power to turn the economy around. There's no going back from that. You can't just say next time, now we're just going to let people suffer and we're just going to wait this out. You have to do what you can. And that begins with Hoover. And in the 30s, he, out of necessity, he was right from the very start far more active than any other president had been in fighting the downturn. He was getting credit from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and everybody else for just how vigorous he was in his response to the stock market crash. And that generally is something that people don't know these days. And as the Depression got deeper, he kept doing more and more and more out of necessity, and went further than I think he ever dreamed he would go in involving the federal government in an economic downturn. At the time, there was a firm view in America that relief of people affected by economic downturns was a local responsibility, that it was something that started at the community level, something that municipal bodies did, community chests, and local relief were seen as the answers to people in distress. It was neighbors looking after neighbors, and nobody saw a need, or few people saw a need for the federal government to give direct relief payments to victims of the Depression. It's one thing to do countercyclical policies. It's another to start using the federal treasury to essentially bail out victims of the Depression. And very few people wanted that done in the 1930s. There was a sense among the nation's mayors and governors that it was insulting to them to say that the federal government had to step in, because it implied that mayors and governments and governors and community leaders weren't doing their job or weren't up to the job. And they looked at it as federal overreach, as federal meddling in their areas of jurisdiction. So there was just not a lot of appetite for direct relief. And even when Roosevelt did finally bring it in himself, he always did it as a very temporary measure, and he only did it after about 4 or 5 years of depression, when it was clear that this wasn't an ordinary downturn. So Hoover didn't go as far as Roosevelt did, and wasn't as complete a Keynesian as we would now consider Keynesians to be. But Keynes was one of Hoover's great cheerleaders during Hoover's administration, thought Hoover was making a lot of great moves. So he was, it was a much more complicated situation, and his involvement was much more nuanced than people generally understand.
Yeah, and maybe to wrap up with the Hoover talk, what was his life like after his presidency? Obviously, we discussed the fact that it took a deep toll on him. The loss and the criticism, and the fact that there was a depression and Roosevelt's attacks, but he eventually bounced back. And as you mentioned, I think he was the oldest living president until Carter, and then George H.W. Bush. He died at 90 years old. What did he do with the rest of his life?
After what would he have been? Maybe in his 70s, when Truman came to power, and Truman involved Hoover in public life again in a number of ways, starting with sending him to Europe to help in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, help with the food distribution and rebuilding efforts in Germany. Hoover was kind of a one-man Marshall Plan before the Marshall Plan. And then Hoover also gave, the government had been enormously expanded in its scale and responsibilities during the Second World War. It had colonized huge parts of the American economy. The auto industry had become an arms producer, and the whole food and other and dry goods industries had been put on a wartime footing, and that all had to be unwound after the war. And Truman saw a need to look at the whole of government and to right-size the federal government and figure out which of its new agencies and new administrations would stay, how should things be organized. It was an incredibly important assignment, and he gave it to Hoover, and it was continued under Eisenhower. And so Hoover had a hand in fact, the lead hand in deciding how American government would be organized in a post-war world. And that was one of his greatest achievements, and one of the things that he found, I think, very rewarding in his post-presidential career. So he did that. He wrote a lot of books, about 6 volumes of memoir, published 5 or 6 volumes of speeches, wrote a really good book about Woodrow Wilson in Paris, and he caught a lot of fish, just a ton of fish. He would go fishing and fish from 6 in the morning till 6 at night for 14 days straight, and hardly said a word the whole time, but caught a lot of fish and had a great time. So those are the kinds of things that he liked to do.